Well, I'm glad you could all make it for this episode, because lots of our colleagues who cover politics for the newspapers, known as the lobby, were sent to the wrong Jaguar Land Rover today to see the Prime Minister talking to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
There was a little bit of a postcode mix-up, which made me think, have you ever been in the wrong place for a big news story?
Yes, probably. I mean, I don't know if you can call it the wrong place. It definitely wouldn't say it was the wrong place, but I can remember perhaps an inconvenient place, which was when, with the other programme I do, Any Questions, which I like to plug. So we go around the country every week and go to a different place. And we were in Gairloch in the northwest Highlands of Scotland, which is quite inaccessible. And we had a lovely panel of Scottish politicians set up to be on. And then Rishi Sunak called the election. And suddenly every party wanted to put one of its big heavyweights on because it was like firing the starting gun in the election campaign. So we had to then transport them all from Westminster to Gairloch on a Friday afternoon, which is not the easiest thing to do.
Like a politician airdrop.
Yeah. If you could have airdropped them, it would have been easier, put it that way.
Well, I had a moment in the 2001 election when I was following Tony Blair and he was harangued by a woman called Sharon Storer at a hospital in Birmingham, I think it was. And it was one of that moment when suddenly the election comes alive. You actually have a little bit of interaction between a member of the public who was unhappy about the state of the NHS. And so the Prime Minister had to deal with it. And we were sitting there, we were in the sort of hotel typing away. I was working for the Times then, typing our stories. At last, we had a proper story because it was quite a dull election, actually. And then suddenly our phones started going, and in those days it was just texts. And we're looking at it. Well, you know what, Mr. Prescott, a punch. What's going on like that? And suddenly, of course, it all happened. And the punch, the John Prescott punch, happened on exactly the same moment. And so, of course, the punch became the story, and Sharon Storer was definitely on page 3 or 4. And so the story was taken. So we all realised that we were once again in the wrong place.
Darshini, you're probably always in the right place.
No, I'm not. Well, I've got to say, I'm still scarred by my most recent experience, which was, picture this, up early, out the shower, dripping wet hair, bathrobe, no contact lenses in, I'm blind as a bat. Phone goes, trade deal, US, UK, get on air. Definitely felt in the wrong place. But I don't think anything can quite equal. Do you remember the Rudy Giuliani example in the Four Seasons Garden Centre? I always think of that and think you can't do worse than that, really.
I mean, I'm just glad we're all in the right place. And you're definitely in the right place, because we're going to talk about all the things that have happened in the world and all the plates that are shifting. Some of them in Keir Starmer's favour, apparently, on this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, the correct place to be.
Hello, it's Alex, also in the Newscast studio.
And it's James, also in the studio.
And it's Dharshini, also been let into the studio.
So the reason Keir Starmer had gone to Jaguar Land Rover was because he was then going to have this conference call with Donald Trump where they announced their prosperity deal that the two countries have signed today. We can discuss whether it's a trade deal or not. Spoiler, it's not, in a minute. But luckily, Chris did end up in the right place. But being in the right place meant that he could report on the news, but couldn't get back to Newscast in time. So he sent us this little voice note.
Yes, hello newscasters from Solihull in the West Midlands. Let me introduce you to a central character in today's proceedings, which is the very fetching grey van over there, which we've been zipping around in, because we were sent to Coventry this morning by Downing Street, where Jaguar Land Rover have a plant. It turns out we were sent to the wrong factory in the wrong town, because we were sent from Coventry, I guess a city, to Solihull here, where the main Jaguar Land Rover place is. So 2 Jags, I guess it was, but we ended up in the right one in the end. Prime Minister, was here just a couple of weeks ago, in the days after the imposition of those tariffs, that big announcement from President Trump expressing his concern for the workforce here, and a real palpable sense of relief here in the West Midlands. I was just chatting to the Mayor of the West Midlands, Labour Mayor of the West Midlands, hugely relieved at what the government has managed to negotiate with America. There are others, though, that I talked to, opposition parties, who are saying, hang on a minute, has Keir Starmer indulged in the kind of bombast that you hear from President Trump, the kind of language he's used today, given that a lot of this, so the argument goes, is about mitigating against those tariffs of a a few weeks back, rather than a full, fat, comprehensive trade deal, etc., etc. There are other elements to this deal, though, which we'll need to unpick and scrutinise, and lots of industries, businesses will be doing just that. I think we should acknowledge that from the government's perspective, they were the first to negotiate this deal with America. That's something of a political and diplomatic achievement. And they're going to badge this alongside that deal with India the other day, and what's expected in about 10 days, the beginning of the week after next, with the European Union, as a month of these different trade deals, trying to point, after all the headwinds they've faced, towards stuff that they're managing to achieve.
Chris, thank you very much. And thank you for giving us lots of food for thought for the rest of this episode. So, Dharshini, let me get this right. This is a trade deal that isn't a trade deal, that lowers tariffs, but only because tariffs had gone up a lot a few weeks ago.
Which lowers tariffs that didn't exist until maybe 2 or 3 months ago at the most. It is extraordinary, isn't it? Here we had all that. You heard all that in the Oval Office, and that we've done this in 6 weeks. Yeah, amazing. But this doesn't really compare to what we were talking about in President Trump's first term. You know, that free trade deal, taking away all those tariffs, instead of which you're left in a situation whereby we've still got 10% tariffs on most goods sold by the UK into the US. And guess what? Tariffs have gone up on British goods. They've come down on American ones. Make of that what you will.
But Alex, you can see why the Prime Minister wanted to go to JLR, to Jaguar Land Rover, because it is good news for the car industry. Okay, it might not be the world that we were in before Donald Trump, but it's definitely not the very gloomy world the car industry was facing from the day he put the tariffs on.
Yeah, so in terms of the headlines of it, what there was and what there is now, so the UK was 25% tariffs on steel, aluminium and cars. And I think despite the fact that Donald Trump was touting this as some sort of full comprehensive trade deal, there was always an expectation from this end that it was actually going to be quite narrowly focused on mitigating those tariffs. And there has been some shift in that area. So the cars now goes down from the 25% plus the previous 2.5% tariff down to a 10% tariff on up to 100,000 cars. And just for a bit of context, I think we sold about 102,000 or exported about 102,000 the previous year. They've got rid of tariffs on steel and aluminium, but that 10% tariff across the board stays. And then there's some other bits and pieces like access to some farm products, including beef. And there was much talk about maybe the tax on big tech companies on the revenues they raise in the UK was going to be scrapped. That hasn't been, but there's talk about further negotiation on digital services. So I think on the whole, Downing Street will see this as a win, because it has managed to alleviate the tariffs in those areas which were looking pretty painful for some sectors, particularly the car industry, hence the big visit to Jaguar Land Rover. But Dharshini's right to point out all the caveats around that we're not in a better position than we were before the so-called Liberation Day. In fact, in most sectors, the picture still looks worse. It is worth saying, though, I think Downing Street, the reason, I mean, like when you just saw like Keir Starmer on the end of a phone and then Donald Trump in the White House, and like the language between them was like, you know, I can't remember how many times Keir Starmer called him Donald.
Yeah, let's have a little listen and people can judge for themselves.
It's really, in particular, the agreement with one of our closest and most cherished allies. And we're so happy that that's the way it worked out.
This is a really fantastic, historic day in which we can announce this deal between our two great countries. And I think it's a real tribute to the history that we have of working so closely together.
Yeah, Alex, I interrupted you, but laying it on thick.
They were laying it on thick, and I think they were very keen to stress how brilliantly they've done. And I think you have to say that this is a bit of a diplomatic and politically significant win for Downing Street, because they were first in the queue for getting some sort of deal. Not a full trade deal by any stretch of the imagination, but some sort of deal. They were first in the queue. They've been working on it for an awfully long time. They wanted to achieve this, and they had all that language from Donald Trump about how important the UK is. And from a US perspective, obviously what this enables Donald Trump to do is say, look, my strategy's working, because now we've got people queuing up to do trade deals that are going to be beneficial to the US. So I think in the political and diplomatic terms, from a Downing Street perspective, it's clearly a win, which is why you had all that kind of language of love in between the two.
And James, it was interesting seeing Keir Starmer being drawn into doing diplomacy in a Trumpian way, with lots of superlatives, lots of first name terms, lots of historical analogies that maybe someone else wouldn't really draw because they're maybe not really that relevant. And it all happening in real time on TV, like a sort of weird chat show with phones.
Yeah, look, the White House at the moment does an awful lot in terms of television. If you remember, there's that famous moment at the end of the Zelensky Oval Office harangue moment where Trump sort of says, almost as an aside, this is going to look great on television.
You're not acting at all thankful, and that's not a nice thing. I'll be honest, that's not a nice thing. All right, I think we've seen enough. What do you think? Huh? This is going to be great television, I will say that.
So an awful lot of this is performative, and that's what we saw today. It was highly choreographed. It was designed very much to look like that. And what was interesting, what struck me, was just how much Trump seemed to need this as much as the Brits. The Brits, have clearly, they have protected British jobs that otherwise, were potentially at risk. But at the same time, what Donald Trump was doing, as Alex was suggesting, is that he was demonstrating that his strategy has worked, because his tariff policy has been widely criticised as being, self-harming. And what he's trying to show is that actually, no, the leverage works, that if you put pressure, then countries come to the table, they negotiate, they do a deal. And this is now the case study. This is sort of the gold standard to show the rest of the world. But also, as I was watching it, what struck me was that the utter contrast with the way, in my life, the as important deal, which was the natural resources, minerals deal that the United States has agreed with Ukraine just the other day. Well, the Americans chose very deliberately not to have that on television.
Yeah.
Right. That was done with still photographs, and the president was nowhere near it.
And is that because Ukraine actually got a good deal?
Well, in part because Ukraine got a good deal, but he didn't want to associate himself with it visually. And I think, so what's really interesting, the contrast also, if you remember, Keir Starmer, whenever he's disagreed with Donald Trump, he has done it off television.
And
he's done it subtly in Downing Street readouts and obscure things, which he knows the president is never going to see or read, even if it was put in front of him. And so, in other words, we saw that contrast today.
And what's interesting, I'm so sorry, on that point is just how I think Keir Starmer felt quite vindicated by that approach today. In fact, he almost referenced it when he was doing his press conference at Jaguar Land Rover in saying, look, some people suggested, not exactly in these words, but I should have taken a tougher line on Donald Trump. But look, this just shows that if you storm out the room and hang up the phone instead of staying and fighting for your country's interests, in his words, it doesn't pay off, and this has.
But I suppose the point that Chris made was that there is a small faint hint of a possible political risk potentially down the line at another time, at another place in years to come, with that picture of Peter Mandelson next to the president. As we've seen in recent days, it applies to different countries and different polities. How close you should get to Trump, whether you oppose, whether you should resist, whether you should go with the flow. And I think we have such an unstable American politics at the moment that I think clearly you've got to make a choice, but there are clearly risks. It's not just upside, being sensible, moderate, staying close, engaging, all of which is very sensible, normal mainstream diplomacy. But if you go, there's a balance to be drawn.
Yeah, and you're referring to that moment where Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, the ambassador in Washington, was stood behind Donald Trump as all this was happening in the Oval Office. And at one point, Donald Trump said to him, "I love your accent."
In my view, as the Prime Minister has said, just shows what two countries who trust each other, who are confident in each other and are familiar with each other can do, not just for ourselves, but for the rest of the world who need to benefit from a bigger and better international trading system.
Thank you very much. It was beautifully stated. What a beautiful accent, too. I'd like to have that accent. Thank you.
My mother would be proud.
Dharshini, to go back to the contents of this, I still keep saying the word deal, which you're going to tell me off for. Pact, prosperity pact. Yeah. Alex said the word beef. Now, people would hear that and go, isn't there something weird about American beef that British consumers don't like? What's gone on there?
Well, hormone-treated beef. This is the idea that Americans tend to sort of treat cattle. And remember, chlorine-washed chicken is the same thing as well. It's about sort of doing the opposite to what the EU does, which it says we have certain standards for farming, which means stuff doesn't get into the food chain, but Americans do it the other way around, and so they have hormone-treated beef, and we don't tend to like that. So there was a lot of, worries about that, and the government always said this is not on the table. Again, quite interesting when you heard front and centre President Trump talking about more access for American beef into the markets, and then we heard, I think it was the Agriculture Secretary saying, actually, we're going to see exports of beef increase exponentially. And we went, whoa, okay, what does that mean? And when you looked at what Downing Street actually said, and that almost sheepish admission at the press conference from Keir Starmer that no, standards are not going to change. And the Farmers Union said this is quite reassuring. So you can see that sort of difference in messaging, and that reflects the difference in content as well. So,
and it was interesting when our colleague Tom Bateman, who normally works at the State Department, he was asking the questions to the President in the Oval Office after all of this. And he said to him about animal welfare standards. And Trump actually said, under RFK, as the health secretary, we're going to start getting rid of all these additives in our food. So actually, maybe our standards will be becoming more British standards, which of course is then why you have to have your quotas coming into the UK to protect the UK from being swamped by loads of American beef
although they do actually produce some of it to a different standard to sell into the UK market. So always the increase of that. We wait and see. But overall, I thought it was really interesting, that difference in Keir Starmer sounding slightly defensive at JLR.
Well, that's almost definitely, I completely agree, but I think that's almost definitely because of the political sensitivity around the farming industry in particular at the moment from this government's perspective. And, those particular issues of whether or not, as farmers would see it, they could be undercut by other products coming in from the US. I think the government has been so super keen to say absolutely no way, not least because it has been a real touch point issue for some time in trade negotiations in other forums, but also because of things around the inheritance tax changes. There is a particular political sensitivity to the farming community in the UK at the moment.
But there's also that issue, isn't there, about 10% remaining, as we were saying before, on most goods going into the US, which, and so, the response was, hang on a minute, we have balanced trade, you're calling this a win, we still have tariffs that are 10% higher. And the rest of the world will be watching this, and Trump is clearly quite keen to make an example of the UK to say, even when we are in balance, you are still going to have to pay a higher price. Remember that when you're negotiating.
And also, Alex, just in terms of how the news cycle works, quite shortly after this, the new Pope was announced, which means all the news tonight and all the newspapers tomorrow will be about the new Pope, Leo XIV, and not about Starmer's great triumph with Trump, as he would see it.
Yeah, and I was actually sat waiting to go on the news channel to talk about the trade deal when suddenly they broke away because there was breaking news and white smoke coming up over St. Peter's Square. So I think that's absolutely going to push this off the front pages. And from a Downing Street perspective, again, because we have to remember, as we're sitting here talking, it's on the back of what has been a really rocky week for the Labour Party, particularly in Parliament, because they had that bruising set of local election results, as did the Conservatives. But in terms of the Labour Party, there has been this kind of growing political sore around some of the decisions that have been made in Downing Street around things like the winter fuel payment and upcoming decisions on welfare, which are causing quite a lot of consternation within the party. So I think this was really seen from Downing Street's perspective on the back of the trade deal that they did with India as a big political win that they wanted to champion, which was why there was this dash to Jaguar Land Rover and Keir Starmer so keen to get on the phones in front of the cameras to talk to Donald Trump. And there is a risk, of course, because of the nature of the news cycle, that the news about the Pope is going to push it off the front pages.
And Dharshini, that Indian trade deal, and we can call it a trade deal.
Yeah,
it's
that one is a
proper
trade
classic
deal.
trade deal. Happens in the ancient history of Tuesday this
goodness.
week. Now that you've had a chance to go through the fine print of it, what's your take on that on Thursday?
Well, that was quite an achievement, we've got to say, to pull off that trade deal with India. And you can see why the government, I'd like to think that the Department of Business and Trade, those trade negotiators, are probably cracking open a bottle of sparkling something or other from the Napa Valley to celebrate pulling off both these things, because they are quite an achievement. They are quite tricky. They're two particularly tricky trade partners to get deals over the line with. But even that India deal, when you look at the long-term prospects for it, adds 0.1% to GDP. When we look at what's on the table here, actually, it repairs some of the damage caused by the tariffs we've seen introduced by President Trump. It doesn't go a very long way. It doesn't really shift the dial at all. Although, as we're hearing there, for workers at JLR, this is obviously a huge relief to know there's some protection for the industry there.
There was also a certain amount of relief that this deal with the Indians was announced before India launched its strikes against targets in Kashmir, because there was a huge worry within Whitehall that these two issues could suddenly become blurred and messed up.
But does that mean, though, in that conflict between India and Pakistan, that because of the trade relationship, the UK is on India's side of that conflict? Just to bring in a whole other news story.
No, not because of that particular trade deal. I mean, the UK on this has always, except for a sort of a slight moment when Robin Cook, when he was Foreign Secretary, suggested that he might sort of get involved, and it would cause huge controversy of trying to resolve this issue, has always tried to stay very much, neutral, not least because there are so many voters in this country who are British Indians and British Pakistanis, for whom this is a hugely sensitive issue, not least because there are an awful lot of British nationals and dependents, about 1 million, according to the Foreign Secretary, in India and Pakistan right now, for whom this is obviously a highly important issue. And so the UK has always, wanted to try and play it very even-handedly. So I think they would not allow any kind of trade deal to sort of get in the way of that, I think.
Understood. But to go back to the contents of the trade deal, wasn't it fascinating, Alex, that the big news after the deal had been signed was something that sounds quite technical, which is social security cooperation between the UK and India, which then became a big political row about whether the government was giving a kind of national insurance bung to Indian workers.
Yeah.
Where's that ended up?
Well, effectively exempting Indian workers from paying national insurance for a set period of time. And
if they're sent here by an Indian company.
That's right. And the government was then pointing out, we have very similar arrangements with other countries on these terms. But of course, it gave the Conservatives, they were saying, hang about here. You are, going to encourage more Indian firms to send Indian workers here instead of people employing British workers because there'd be some sort of tax deduction. So it went back and forth for a little while. But I think what is quite interesting in terms of the political reaction to both the India trade deal and the US non-trade deal, because Dharshini will tell me off if I call it a trade deal, is that, you've got the government saying, look at what we've managed to achieve, which the last lot didn't manage to achieve. First thing, there is a sort of recognition from the Conservatives that they call it a Brexit benefit, that you can now go off and strike these trade deals because, as some in the Conservative Party would see it, you're not hampered by ties to the European Union. But interestingly, on the back of the trade deal, non-trade deal, trade agreement pact, Dharshini, tell me off if I'm wrong, with the US, the Conservatives were quick out the block to say, actually, we don't think this is much good at all because we are still in a worse position effectively than we were before Trump imposed these extra tariffs in the first place. So what have we actually really achieved here? Nigel Farage of Reform UK said it's a step in the right direction. So it's just quite interesting to have seen the kind of political fallout and people angling for position when the government clearly wants to herald this as a resounding success, both of these deals.
Well, Kemi Badenoch today said on social media that the US deal, the UK had been shafted.
Yeah. She was harsh, really harsh about it.
On a pure numbers basis, it does appear that way, right? When you look at what has been left at the moment, as you say, our tariffs are higher than they were. In fact, they're 3 times higher than they were. American tariffs, well, they've come down by 2/3 as a result of this deal. So when you look at that, anything but a level playing field, and US stands to benefit more in terms of export sales. Having said that, what we heard officials again and again keen to say is this is just the beginning. And there's more work to be done on this. And when you look at the potential there, and we don't really talk about services, right? But a lot of that is linked to our trade in goods. Anything that makes that smoother does really help. I'm going with Tariff Pact.
I'm going to go with that then. I should do as I'm told by Dharshini for sure. Tariff Pact it is.
And James, I'm just thinking back to when you said you were working at the Times, and I'm picturing you there at your typewriter, choosing every word carefully.
Typewriter.
More computers is the thing called a typewriter.
My first job was on the Times Educational Supplement. And I did, I did actually have a typewriter.
Wonderful.
With carbon paper and and literally the two copies. One went to the subs and one went to the news desk, and literally there was a spike on which my copy was placed. Yes.
But the reason I conjure up that beautiful poetic image is to get you to be like our linguist. Like that word "shafted" by Kemi Badenoch. That is a very strong word designed to get attention and to appeal to a certain kind of person, isn't it? Do you think?
Yes, but then I can remember reporting on Michael Howard using the word "screwed" in Parliament, and there was a long discussion about whether or not that the BBC could use that in those days. I also remember
maybe we should have had a discussion about shafted before we recorded this.
But remember when. Remember when David Cameron said too many tweets make a...
Yeah, remember that well.
And I had to write the radio broadcast piece on that using the clip in which David Cameron used that phrase, but I was not allowed to use it, even though I had to explain what it meant and its etymology, all without offending any of the audience. I suppose the link with all of this is because I was reminded of that as I saw Peter Mandelson standing next to the president today, was that when Jonathan Powell, who is currently our national security advisor, was, as a younger man, chief of staff to Tony Blair, he sent our then ambassador to Washington, a man called Christopher Mayer.
I know where this is going.
Nowhere. And Jonathan Powell's instructions were to get up the bottom, I shall use that word, of the White House and stay there. And I thought that's the quote that came through my mind when I saw Peter Mandelson standing there, at the left-hand side of the President of the United States, at one point holding hands, together. I thought, well, that's what we instruct our ambassadors to do.
But Alex, just not to fixate on Kemi Badenoch for the whole podcast, but she's mission accomplished because she's getting us to talk about her by using some strong language. But she's had an interesting week because on Tuesday she was really critical of the India trade deal and appeared to look like somebody who was opposed to free trade and a bit more protectionist. And then today she's now complaining about a tariff pact that doesn't do enough free trade. So I'm just not sure which Kemi Badenoch is the real one.
Yeah, and I think that's where the Conservatives, all the way through, I think they have been quite careful, and maybe they found it a bit tricky to define how they react to the way the government's handling the relationship with Donald Trump. And I think, for example, when it comes to the diplomatic approach that Keir Starmer's taken, as we've discussed, where he's decided deliberately not to go in very harshly on Donald Trump and tread quite cautiously, the Conservatives haven't really said that is the wrong approach. It's been the Liberal Democrats more who've been doing the running, suggesting that the government should be taking a harsher stance when it comes to Donald Trump. And on trade deals, as the government was saying that it was attempting to negotiate some sort of agreement with the US over tariffs and trade, the Conservative position has been, you should have done it sooner. We had something almost ready to go. You should have been quicker out the blocks on this. But obviously finding it difficult to criticise the notion of doing some sort of agreement that can alleviate some of the pain for some sectors. So I think it was interesting that Kemi Badenoch took the stance she did as quickly as she did today, saying that actually she doesn't think that this is really a huge amount of benefit to the UK.
And in news, the rule is things come in threes, and the next thing is the deal between the UK and the EU on defence and trade, and perhaps visas for young people, although it sounds like that's getting a bit stickier as the days pass. I've just remembered a time I ended up in the wrong place for the news. It was the last time round the UK was having a big debate about airport expansion. And I'd spotted that Frankfurt was opening a new runway that they'd built in record time. So the fourth runway in Frankfurt. So I got on a very early morning flight to go to Frankfurt Airport. Fell asleep because I like to fall asleep on an early morning flight. Woke up not in Frankfurt, but in Cologne, a really long way away, because Frankfurt Airport was closed because of fog. So Angela Merkel, then the German Chancellor, was there to open a runway that nothing could land on. And then I'm also thinking about the time in Brussels when, do you remember when Theresa May signed that joint report, and it was December in the first year of the Brexit negotiations, and it was the first kind of milestone being reached, and they only agreed to do it at the last minute after the last train had left London. So no one from London could get to Brussels the next morning to see this big milestone. And I was the only person there.
And didn't you doorstep them?
Probably.
I think you did. I thought we saw you there waving your microphone.
My main
at
memory of
people.
that day is working like really, 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 really long and then ending the day doing a live on the 10 o'clock news. And it started snowing in the middle of the live. And I was like, what? Anyway,
that feels like you were in the right place.
I now feel like I'm doing the audiobook of my autobiography, which no one needs to hear. But thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having us.
And thanks to you too for listening to this episode of Newscast. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.
Newscast from the BBC.